It's election day in the US, so rather than debate something that might change tomorrow, we're going to look at the results of another recent election. In July, for the first time in 14 years, British voters elected a Labour government. And 2 weeks later, the new British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, signaled his desire for the country to once again grow closer to Europe.
We want to work with all of you to reset relationships, rediscover our common interest, and renew the bonds of trust and friendship that brighten the fabric of European life.
Back in 2016, under a Tory-led government, Britain shocked the world by choosing to leave the European Union by a narrow 52-48 margin. For many observers, the Brexit vote was seen as a rejection of establishment politicians, and it revealed a groundswell of anger over immigration policy, environmental policy, human rights law, and all sorts of regulatory decisions, especially among white working-class voters. All of this might sound familiar to US voters who remember Donald Trump's victory that same year. Fast forward to today, and the political sands have shifted dramatically. Polls now show that if given the choice again, more people would vote to rejoin the EU than stay out. Welcome to Counterpoint. Each week, we'll look at one pressing question facing world leaders from two opposing points of view. I'm Sasha Polakow-Suransky, a deputy editor at Foreign Policy and your host and moderator for the show. Today, we're going to tackle the question, should the UK rejoin the EU? Joining us to argue that the UK should rejoin the EU is businesswoman, activist, and campaigner Gina Miller. In 2017, Gina led a landmark legal challenge against the Conservative government, which forced it to get Parliament's consent before starting the process of leaving the EU. Welcome, Gina, and thanks for joining us.
Lovely to be here.
And to argue that the UK should not rejoin the EU is former British Chancellor and Business Secretary Kwasi Kwarteng. Welcome, Kwasi, and thanks for being here.
Hello, how are you? Good to see you.
Counterpoint is a production of Foreign Policy in partnership with the Doha Forum. Let's get started. Gina, between 2016 and late 2020, British and EU officials negotiated the precise terms of Brexit, and there were widespread calls for another referendum. The issue aroused so much passion that in 2019 it brought hundreds of thousands of protesters into the streets of London, calling for the government to allow another vote. But even though the Labour Party has a large majority now, there doesn't seem to be much clamoring to rejoin the EU. Do you think there should be a second referendum? And what's the advantage of rejoining now?
Well, where we are today, I would say there isn't a place for another referendum. Actually, I never supported another referendum because of the destruction that it actually did the first time. And the world has moved on since 2016. My belief is very strongly that we do need to reset our relationship. There are underlying structural issues that, irrespective of which political party you're from, you cannot ignore, such as the aging of our population, what's going on with climate change, what is going on with conflict around the world. We can't operate in isolation. Lots of people in Britain think of us, an island unto ourselves. But I'd say that is one of the problems that led us to where we are. And I think going back to your introduction, it is very important to remember that Brexit was not an economic argument alone. It was actually a cry from the ordinary person in the street that they felt ignored, that the economics of our country was not delivering for them. The public services for our country was not delivering for them. It was a cry for them to be heard. And that cry is still desperately wanting to be heard. The other side of that cry for help was also mistrust in our government. So I do think we need to become much more resilient, especially in terms of our supply chain. And to me, that means it's about a closer relationship to the EU. But for me, that starts with the customs union rather than rejoining, because I don't think either side has the bandwidth to actually negotiate rejoining.
Kwasi, you argued in favor of Brexit from early on and voted to push it through Parliament, and then you held key economic policy-making roles in Boris Johnson's and Liz Truss's governments. Yeah. Why, in your view, should the UK not rejoin or even seek this closer relationship with the EU that Gina mentions?
Funnily enough, I agreed with an awful lot of what Gina said. But in terms of should we rejoin, firstly, I think things have moved on. It's not clear to me that the EU would want us back. There are also issues if we rejoin regarding the single currency. It seems very unlikely to me that we could rejoin fully as a member without signing up to the single currency. And the second issue, I think, is the Labour government. It's had a very rocky start. And so politically, I don't think it would make much sense for Keir Starmer, weakened as he is today, to countenance full re-entry into the European Union. Very finally, I'd say that I think that there could well be a customs union deal. They won't call it the customs union. That could happen. I would be opposed to that, but I'm not in government. I don't really have a say, and the government has a huge majority.
So before you two start agreeing too much, let's get a bit more into the politics.
I'm sorry. I'm really sorry about that. I didn't expect
I didn't expect it.
A lot of what you say is reasonable, Gina.
So the Tories got clobbered in the last election, and I'm wondering, Kwasi, do you think that Brexit and its implementation were at least partially to blame for that result?
Not really. I think the part, I was involved in all of this stuff, so I think the party was just exhausted and it turned it in on itself, and there was too much drama, there was too much chaos. So it was a much wider set of circumstances than Brexit. I think you could say, and I'm trying to be objective here, I think Brexit definitely created more instability in our political system than ever had been before. But there were other issues like COVID, and also the fact we've been in power for 14 years. That's a very long time. And I think people had enough of us.
But on Brexit, people were supposed to gain all these benefits. And what tangible benefits do you think the average British voter has actually seen?
I think it's been sort of so-so. I don't think it's been a huge disaster. I don't think it's been a huge success. But the reason why it wasn't cleanly done was because the Prime Minister gambled in 2017, the then Prime Minister Theresa May, gambled on an election whose sole purpose, in her view, was to increase her majority. She said, you've got to strengthen my hand. I need to be in a powerful position to argue against the EU. And then, of course, she lost the majority and she was incredibly weak. The EU knew that whatever she agreed, she wouldn't be able to get through the Parliament. So we wasted 2 years doing nothing. The Parliament was in total gridlock. And in my mind, that botched election resulted in lots and lots of mindless debate, endless debate, and it essentially led to the arrival of Boris Johnson in power.
Gina, I'm assuming you disagree with some of that, and I'm curious what you think British citizens lost as a result of Brexit.
I disagree with probably a lot of that, actually, which is where we're going to come to disagreeing, is that Brexit actually, what it did, it was a catalyst to take us into a new world of politics in the UK. The damage of Brexit was not just economic. It's actually what it's done to the trust in this country, making the idea that facts don't matter, experts don't matter, creating this distance between truth and untruth. 2016 was a pivotal time in the US and I think in the UK, both because of Trump and Brexit, to creating a completely different landscape when it comes to our political discourse and trust in politics. And those have been hugely damaging to our democracies. But if you look at the economics of it, you've got independent people like Cambridge Economics who are saying that the cost of Brexit is 140 billion, or you've got the new report that's come out from Ashton University just last month, which says, that the long-term effect is something like 300 billion is set to be wiped off our UK economy by 2035. So, the idea of it not being an economic damage, yes, it is. We know that our exports are down. If you look at the actual data from 2022 to 23, that we know that our exports to the EU are down 17% and the imports are down 23%. These are not subjections. That's the data that's showing that of what happened in those years. So it is affecting us. It's hugely affecting our small and medium-sized businesses who now have a burden of paperwork, because one of the promises of Brexit was going to be reducing paperwork and reducing regulation. And the exact opposite has happened. And it's burying these small and medium-sized businesses. The smaller businesses are going to have a very tough time now and going forwards, because we knew they'd be so overwhelming. The government in April of this year, the UK government at the time, only brought in 50% of the border checks that would be needed on agricultural foods, on veterinary products, on medicines, on a raft of products. The other 50% will come in this month, and we will see the effect of that next year. The impact on forward investment has been dire. Listings on our stock market have dried up. There is a direct Brexit impact. And this is why I'm so angry at the Labour government, because I think they lack the competence and the courage to actually tell the truth about Brexit. I'm really very disappointed in the Labour government. Unless we can start economic growth and productivity and inward investment, we're not going to get out of where we are. We need stability, we need a long-term plan, and we need to be much more attractive. And part of that attraction is being a springboard to Europe. And I agree with Kwasi that it won't be called a customs union. All the old terms are too toxic. So they'll have to come up with something different. But we have got to do something to repair the damage to our economy.
So, Kwasi, you said earlier that personally you would be opposed to a customs union or whatever we want to call it. Could you articulate what your objection is? Why is there a problem with that kind of policy?
Look, there's no point being halfway in and halfway out. Gina makes a case, but there's a whole lot of other things that have happened, okay? The striking fact is that if you look at the economies of the three biggest countries in the Eurozone, they haven't grown faster than we have. So unless you're making a slightly counterintuitive argument that we would have somehow, by being in there, grown faster than them, or somehow we would have increased their growth, I don't really understand that. I mean, I know there's lots of data, but any sophomore economist, as you would call it, knows that you can't just reduce everything to one factor. There's a whole bunch of other things that have happened since 2016, relating particularly to COVID and the huge expansion of government balance sheets all over the Western world that have affected growth levels and affected inflation and other things. So to blame everything on Brexit, I think, is wrong. But generally, I think that you can't be halfway in and halfway out. I think if we're going to go out, we've got to be able to set our own rules. And I feel sad because I don't think we managed to get the best of it. I think the Conservative Party was bitterly divided. And I was a minister for much of that time, and we simply didn't know what we were doing. I remember asking vividly, it was a Thursday, and I said, what are we going to say on Tuesday? And the people in Number 10 said, we just want to get through today. We don't know what's going to happen on Tuesday. And in a way, they were right, because you just never knew whether important bits of legislation were going to go through the House or not. And the government had many, many defeats. And a lot of the confusion and chaos that flowed from that was as a direct consequence of that botched election.
Sure, but Kwasi, you were part of Boris Johnson's government.
I was part of all those governments. I was in May's government. I was in Boris's government.
And so was it inevitable that the form of Brexit that the country ended up getting after Boris Johnson won in 2019, was that inevitable? Or could there have been a softer form of Brexit and a closer association with the EU?
I mean, this is quite getting into the weeds of the history. But what happened after 2017 was that Theresa May spent a couple of years negotiating with the EU a form of withdrawal. By the time Boris Johnson had come in, which was July 2019, as I remember, there was no way he was going to unpick that agreement. The EU were not willing to negotiate it. So, as I say, everything that he did was circumscribed and constrained by the deal that Theresa May had negotiated. And that deal was compromised by the fact she didn't have a majority. The EU had a much stronger hand. She didn't have the power to say no to them, essentially.
So, Gina, let's go back to your earlier comments about Labour. A lot of people think that Starmer barely mentioned Brexit during the campaign this year because he was worried that the issue might alienate Labour supporters in the North, people who voted Leave. Do you think there are any political risks now for Starmer if he shifts to a more pro-Europe stance like the one you're advocating?
I think they've miscalculated from the get-go when it comes to this election, because if they were much more open in saying what we are seeking a closer relationship, and that includes, for example, joining data agencies such as the European Environmental Agency, or we are looking at a youth mobility scheme, if these were things that they'd put in there, because actually us Brexiting has also affected our labour market and the amount of medicines we now have, shortages coming forward. So there's lots of different ways. But going back to your question, there was no reason, looking at the data, underlying data and voting intention, why Labour could not have found a story to tell. Because when you look at, for example, young people, if you strip out over 65s in any poll that you look at, which talks about maybe rejoining or getting closer, it's vastly different. It tends to be closer to 70-odd% instead of, say, 62, because younger people are much more in favour of joining or getting a closer relationship with Europe. They're much more Eurocentric. And Labour lost a lot of those young people because they didn't actually talk about Brexit enough and they didn't talk about the environment enough. Overall, their vote did not go up. It actually went down 0.5% when it came to the election this year that they won a landslide in. It's a very peculiar thing in our voting system. So they don't seem to have found or don't have the political experience to tell the narrative of how they bring in a strategy, a plan. They still seem to me to be in campaigning mode rather than in governing mode. And that is what I'm finding very disappointing, is where is their vision for our economy, for growth, for EU, for our labour market, for so many things that impact our prosperity and our security as a country.
You're listening to Counterpoint. I'm Sasha Polakow-Suransky. We'll be right back. So, Kwasi, I have a question about the economy for you. When the Tories pushed for Brexit, the promise was to take back control and create a sort of freewheeling, free trading, low-tax Singapore model. But now you have this huge Labour majority and none of the restraints of the EU. Do you think there's a risk that the UK will now end up with a higher tax, higher spending regulatory state? In other words, an economy more like Sweden's than Singapore's?
Look, that could happen. But you've got to remember that, as Gina alluded to earlier, it wasn't just an economic debate. In fact, people knew that there was an economic risk to Brexit. But actually, what really tipped the balance was the fact that people were concerned about immigration, and that's a separate conversation because it's actually very high at the moment. But they were also concerned about sovereignty, however you define that. So for people like me, yes, Singapore on Thames may have been attractive, but the 17 million people who voted for Brexit, they each had very different views as to how they wanted the economy to develop. So that was partly the problem of the referendum. And this is what Gina pointed about referendums. They're a very blunt instrument. And if you have a referendum, which is essentially a binary question, yay or nay, black or white, and then you put that in a parliamentary context where you have a hung parliament, it's very, very difficult to get any clarity because, the 650 MPs all will have different views as to how to interpret the results of the referendum. So I don't think that there was any economic plan, as it were, behind the Brexiteers because they were all voting for different reasons. Secondly, the biggest thing that happened in the last 8 years wasn't Brexit. It was COVID. I mean, I remember I was a junior bag carrier for Philip Hammond when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. And we expanded, I think, over the term of the Parliament, which is 5 years, NHS spending about £84 billion. And that seemed like a huge amount of money. And we just couldn't get our heads around it. Literally 3 years later, we were signing checks for £300 billion. And nobody thought anything of it. And the extent to which that changed the fiscal environment, the tax regime, because we had to claw the money back that we spent, the growth environment. I think, people will marvel in the future. Historians will look at this in astonishment and see across the West, we literally blew up our balance sheets to pay for, rightly, for protection over this pandemic, which in itself had been unprecedented, hadn't been seen for 100 years. So, COVID has a massive part to play in the economic destinies of this decade. And it's easy to overlook that.
Fair enough. But going back to the sovereignty argument you made, I mean, this was a buzzword, even if people came to their support for Brexit for all sorts of different reasons. And you mentioned migration, and I want to get into that in a minute with both of you. But on this question of economic sovereignty, it seems that the Conservatives have sort of given Labour free rein to do all sorts of things that the Conservative Party loathes, because now Labour could use that sovereignty to pursue a statist economic model rather than a free market one. I mean, how do you feel about that?
So look, in theory, we loathe that stuff, but we didn't govern that way. That's one of the issues that we had. We presided over a massive expansion in public spending, which we then paid for by increasing taxes. And actually, the path that we were on isn't that different from where Labour is. I know it sounds paradoxical, and in theory, we're ideologically different and all the rest of it. But in practice, if you look at where we were between, let's say, 2022 and 2024, the path has been set. And what's ironic is that Labour have done things that I wouldn't have done, but they're not that different from the tail end of the Conservative government. And that was one of the reasons why, among other things, a lot of people were disillusioned with us.
Sasha, if I can come in here, I want to take it into a different direction, which is reform. People at this time, this election, this July, voted for change. That was the word that Labour said over and over again. And people are desperate for change and desperate for things after 14, 15 years. If Labour cannot deliver that change, and we have a Reform Party which did remarkably well, we have Reform MPs in Parliament, and we have a more right-wing leader in the Tory party, in Kwasi's party, if that party is somebody who then cozies up to Nigel Farage, and then we end up with a Labour government that's unable to deliver the change that they have promised and people are clinging on to, then I think we could see a very worrying lurch to the right, which could be, in the UK, a right-wing government aligning with right-wing governments and politicians across Europe and possibly in the US. And that is what's so frightening to me, is that we started on this path. And as Kwasi says, it doesn't matter who's in government. The structural damage is there. The political damage is there. And the democratic damage is there. And it is, how do we undo that in the space of 3 to 5 years?
Let me just interject a little bit of context for people who don't know about Reform, and then I'll come to you for your response on it, Kwasi. So the Reform Party is the latest incarnation of Nigel Farage's political project. Farage was one of the key proponents of Brexit and used to be the head of a party called UKIP, UK Independence Party, and Reform received approximately 14% of the vote in recent elections.
It was 14.5.
14.5, although it translated into very few seats because of the first past the post system in the UK. Kwasi, what do you make of Gina's argument?
So look, unlike Gina, I'm not terrified of centre-right government, right-wing governments necessarily. I mean, I think that the country is very polarised, as the United States is. And one of the reasons why Labour managed to get a huge majority on a 33% vote was because effectively the right-wing vote was split. Reform took away lots and lots of votes that had been Conservative, and that meant that the Conservatives lost something like 60 more seats than otherwise would have been the case. And that just shows that the electorate is more split today than it has been in my lifetime. You know, we've got, I think, only 58% of the people voted Conservative or Labour, which is a historic low for the two main parties. Now, what Gina says is right, is that as a consequence of that, it doesn't take a big backlash against Labour for other parties, potentially Reform and the Conservatives, to come into power. And that's why, going back to what Gina was saying earlier about Labour not being courageous about rejoining or whatever the EU, it's very clear to me, politically, that's a very dangerous thing for them to do, because the one thing we know about Reform voters is that most of them is that they don't like the EU.
So let's get into this migration debate a little bit more. It seems that one of the consequences of Tory policies after Brexit was that there was more skilled migration from non-EU countries and a lot fewer low-skilled workers coming from Europe. In other words, more highly educated Indian tech workers and fewer Italian waiters. And Gina, I'm wondering if there were a closer association with the EU, whatever we call it, would you support reducing non-EU migration to allow more European workers back into the UK?
I think we have to have a really detailed conversation about migration, because our migration figures at the moment in the UK include things like foreign students, which are actually an economic benefit. And I have never understood why they're in that figure. And then you take away the Ukraine scheme and the Afghan scheme. I mean, a true migration figure, if you look at it, is probably closer to 400,000, not the 700,000 that keeps being talked about or touted. Where we are as a country, pragmatically, I think we are lacking skills in certain areas across many sectors. And whilst we get our own people trained, I think we do need to have skilled people in who can work in our economy, be it in tech, in agriculture, in veterinary science, in NHS, in care services, whatever the sectors are. So I do think we need to have a skills-based or business-based case for legal migration. But it is unsustainable, our level of migration. And I remember when I was going around in 2015 in the lead up to the referendum vote in 2016, I remember being told over and over again, no, leaving the EU means we won't have any immigrants. That's how it was being interpreted. They thought it meant the end of migration. I spent a lot of my time going around into places that eventually voted Brexit, some very poor parts of Wales, North England, Scotland, etc., saying to people, when we Brexit, one of the results will be there'll be more people who look like me. There'll be more brown people coming to your country to do the jobs, and they'll bring in more relatives than we do from those who are in Europe. because they tend to bring in on average one person, whereas somebody coming in from, an African country or an Asian country will bring in 3 to 4 people. So, the writing was on the wall. We knew this was going to happen to some degree. There was no space for nuance in the Brexit debate. And because of that, people are so angry because, again, they thought it would automatically lead to lower migration, legal and illegal. And that has not happened.
Kwasi, do you think that what Gina's described played out? And do you think that turned off a lot of Brexit voters because they saw something that they had been told wouldn't happen?
Yeah, look, I think the problem, among many problems the Conservative Party had, goes back before Brexit. So we campaigned in 2010, and I was a candidate then. I got elected that year on a platform of tens of thousands of migrants a year. That tens of thousands number or range hadn't been plucked from the blue. It's actually the average. If you take the average annual migration, net migration, from about 1950 to 2000, so that over 50 years, those post-war years. And so in 2010 or 2009, as we were in the run-up to that election, David Cameron said, we've got to get back to the tens of thousands. Well, of course, that didn't happen. In fact, the opposite happened. So we had 1 year, I think last year, 22-23, where we had 745,000 come in a year. Now, Gina's right. A portion of that was students, a portion were workers, families, that sort of thing. And the true figure may well be 400,000. I don't know. But the fact is 400,000 is an order of magnitude greater than the 50,000 a year that were coming in for 50 years post-war. So what people are seeing is immigration on a scale that's unprecedented, 10 times roughly, or 9 times the old annual figure. And they see that effect in their communities. They see the fact that, there's a huge demand on public services, on schools, on hospitals, on housing in particular, on benefits sometimes. That's what they see. And now you can argue with people and say, look, it's a net economic benefit to the country, and that may be true. But what they see locally is real pressure on public services. And that's why I think Nigel Farage, whom I know, and I rate him as a politician, he jumped on that issue.
But do you think that there's a way to make that case to the same voters that, listen, it may look like your community is changing dramatically, but this is actually a net economic benefit?
I think it's a very difficult argument to make. And my principle, I'm the son of immigrants. My parents came from Ghana in the 60s, in the period I'm talking about, where, there were social tensions, but the numbers were absorbed. I'm old enough to remember the 1997 election. Immigration wasn't even an issue. And it wasn't because the parties were ignoring it. It was because the population was quite stable. We'd had problems with the National Front and other racist groups in the 70s. But by the mid-90s, the extent to which immigration was not an issue in that election is remarkable looking back. But of course, what's happened since then, and since the new century started and the accession countries and all of that, has been a huge increase. And that's what I think is stoking not only reform. You look across Europe, Gina mentioned this earlier. You've got the AfD in Germany. Some of these guys are actual Nazis. Let's not beat about the bush. You've got, obviously, Marine Le Pen's party, and she's trying to reinvent that, but that came from the Front National, which was a nationalist, xenophobic party led by her father. You've got Giorgia Meloni, whose party has roots in the Mussolini-era, fascism then. And these are very real threats. That's what Gina is worried about. But, you can't just denounce the people who are voting for these parties. You've got to actually solve the problem. And I think part of that problem is the scale and size of the immigration. The weight of it is too great for many communities in the West to bear.
Can I come back on one thing on that? Because unlike Kwasi, I was unsuccessful in fighting this election. It was called very quickly, and I was trying to do something quite radical in the UK in starting a party. And so I stood for Parliament. Immigration was not as high on the agenda. The major thing on the doorstep is we've got to get the Tories out because they're toxic. And, the hatred against the Tory party in the UK, I was aware that would be high. It was unfathomable. I was shocked at the level of anger. You cannot underestimate the damage that I'm afraid, Kwasi, that Boris Johnson and that period did to people's trust. in the country. So the anger against the Tories was the thing that won Labour this election we've had in the UK. It was a tactical vote against the Tories. Immigration was not and is not the number one issue in the UK. Integration is an issue. That's a different debate. There is a problem, and it is a problem, about communities not integrating enough. And we do know that.
But you can't deny that Reform did best of the minor parties. I mean, they got 4 million votes. And for lots of those voters, I'm not saying for all the voters, they only got 14%. But the 14% who voted for Reform, for them, immigration was a big issue. And there was a perception that the Tories had failed on that issue. And it's no accident. The seats they won, a lot of those seats were on the eastern coast of England, where they had high levels of migration from the EU and where people were still strongly pro-Brexit, but felt that the Tories had let them down.
So, Gina, I want to go back to something that Kwasi said earlier. He mentioned Marine Le Pen. He mentioned Giorgia Meloni. It seems like the direction in much of Europe is toward far-right parties who are hostile towards migration. Do you worry that getting closer to Europe, whatever we call that closer relationship with the EU, could actually bring those European politics into the UK?
I don't believe so. And the only European country that is extremely worrying, but then you look at its history, is the states in Germany that have now voted in far-right politicians. There is a rise, but what worries me more is with the mass migration of people that's going to increase for a number of reasons, be it war, climate change, whatever. We have not seen the top of the wave of mass migration. So unless we work together on how we deal with that, I do think there is a danger. And that's why I think it's more important than ever that we work collectively on how we deal with migration, which is only going to increase.
I think that's quite catastrophist way of thinking. A lot of these countries, Africa isn't just some, basket case that is going to be mired in sort of some medieval poverty. I've just come back from Nigeria, and there's lots of things happening there. There's lots of growth. There's lots of people wanting to invest. So I don't buy the narrative that these places are going to be devastated and every single person will want to flood into Europe. I don't think that's true. I think the causes of the migration in the 2010s were very specific, actually, to the 2010s. A lot of it was to do with the collapse of regimes in the Middle East and North Africa, particularly Libya. So, yes, there may well be shifts in population, but I don't think we should get too alarmist about it.
So just to broaden beyond migration, though, and looking forward 20, 30 years, you're saying migration from Africa and elsewhere isn't going to be the main issue, but where do you see the UK economy? What will it look like in a couple of decades?
I think what we haven't really understood, and nobody understands, is the degree to which technical innovation, tech, will change the world we live in. I'm 49 years old, so I'm just at that age where I can remember the pre-internet, I can remember pre-mobile phones, I can remember pre-social media, all of that, Uber, all of these things have come in the last 30 years. I'm very positive about the future, actually. I think in 20 years, there's no reason why we can't have as much revolution and change and innovation as we have had in the last 20 or 25 years. And I think that's an exciting prospect. There's a whole host of opportunity. I'm a natural optimist about these things.
Gina, do you have a similarly rosy take on the future of the UK economy?
I'm a natural pragmatist, and I look at data, and I think going into the 2030s, we have a lot of things to face up to in the West, which is the aging of our population. It's not an issue just in the UK, but the effect also of living longer and more unwell. We also have AI, which is very different than GI, which is going to be even more impactful. The experts talk of for every 25 jobs, there'll be one. And what's everyone going to be doing? But more importantly, who are the ownership of these assets? If they're not resident in a particular country paying taxes, then where does the funding of our public purse come from? So you have unwell populations. In the UK at the moment, we have 2.3 million people who are out of work or economically inactive. You have an aging population that's taking rather than giving into our public purse. You then have owners of assets who are not domiciled in the country and paying taxes. We have some really big issues coming up, economic issues, when it comes to the cost of running our countries and our public services. So these are the things that worry me as we go into the 2030s. And that's even before we talk about climate change and what the impact of that will be. So I think there's an awful lot that we need to be debating as we move forwards. And that's what I hope we will do over the next 5-10 years, is we'll talk about and have honest conversations about fundamental changes, as systemic changes need to happen to make sure that we are much more sustainable for the next 100 years or so. I think that's the sort of pivotal point we are in our Western culture.
So, despite a surprisingly agreeable start, I think we actually found plenty of things to disagree on. Thank you to my guests, Gina Miller, founder of the investment company ACM Direct and the True and Fair campaign, and Kwasi Kwarteng, former Conservative Member of Parliament and Chancellor of the UK under Prime Minister Liz Truss. Thanks to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Counterpoint is a production of Foreign Policy in partnership with the Doha Forum. Our production staff includes Karen Given and Dan Efron, with special thanks to Claudia Tatey. Join us next week as we debate, should the Global South denounce Russia's war in Ukraine as an act of imperialism?
I very much don't accept that what happened in February 2022 is imperialism. I think it's an act of war.
If it was wrong, for instance, for America to invade Iraq, then it is wrong for Russia to invade Ukraine.
If you're enjoying Counterpoint, please tell a friend. You can also leave a rating or review on your podcast app. It helps other listeners find our show. I'm Sasha Polakow-Suransky. Thanks for listening.